Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new around here, this is Sam, and
Hello.
he hasn't been on the channel for like a month and a half or something. We sometimes take a while to get through discographies, and it happens. And
Life
today
gets in the
we are going,
way. How dare
yes,
it?
we're going to be ranking the discography of Icehouse. Now, your response will either be, wow, finally someone on YouTube talking about Icehouse, or who the hell are Icehouse? And that, it's an interesting thing. I know that Red Knot on Discord, shout out, will be looking forward to this video. So hopefully one of us at least can satisfy you in that sense. Sam, how do you know about Icehouse? How much did you know? And yeah, those are the only two questions, actually.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll get to it then. I know Icehouse by accident. One day when I was doing a jigsaw puzzle, I had Spotify on, it was shuffling through just random songs, and it gave me Great Southern Land, which is their biggest song, arguably, all about Australia. And it was the first time I'd ever seen the name Icehouse. Although it does mean something to us because we both went to the University of Reading, and there is a bar called Icehouse where we used to go in the early heady days of our friendship.
Which we stopped going to because it closed over COVID, and then we just never went to it again after it reopened.
So rest in peace, the era of us that went to Icehouse, I suppose. But my curiosity grew over time. Eventually, I would listen to Primitive Man, Sidewalk, and Measure for Measure, and also Man of Colours. I didn't really look around at the rest of it. Those are the big four as far as this really obscure band from Australia was concerned. Those are the major albums. And so we both listened to Primitive Man together at one point, and that was as far as I went. I always liked those albums, and I thought, let's not rock the boat with some of the more dodgy ones, including the era where they were briefly called Flowers and released their debut album, Icehouse. And then they were like, well, if we're going to be big internationally, we can't be called Flowers anymore. Apparently there was another band called Flowers. I don't know them, but they were like, let's not muddy those waters.
They then re-released that album as Icehouse with a different track listing, which is not the one we're counting, to make it clear. We're counting the first released version of the album, Icehouse. So
Icehouse by Flowers.
As for me, as you can imagine, all of my Icehouse exposure was through Sam. So I knew Primitive Man, which we listened to together. I knew The Flame from Measure for Measure and a couple songs from Sidewalk, and that was it. That was all I knew going in. And this was an interesting deep dive into you'd call them sort of 80s synth pop, I guess.
Yeah.
Although they do kind of become something a little bit different in the later career, but we'll get into that. Sam, it's your turn to go first. What is your seventh favorite and thus least favorite Icehouse album?
Yes, my least favorite Icehouse album. And of course, I'm not giving away too much for saying I loved doing this. That being said, my last place album is definitely my least favorite album. But it's not just, it's a list of 7, something has to go at the bottom. Big Wheel earns its place as last. It's a 5. There are a few songs in the early part of the album that are like, okay, this is good. If it can maintain this, it can be a solid album. It didn't in a major way. Ivor Davis, bless his heart, I think he's terrific, but I do think that Icehouse is very much a child of their time. They were an 80s band. Ivor Davis could write certain songs that also just so happened to be what the market were asking for in the early 80s. He tried to get away from that because the times were changing in the 1990s and tried to be a bit more 90s sounding, and it didn't work. He left behind the synth very much. It was all heavy guitar. There's him trying to be some sort of like, almost trying to veer into heavy metal almost on some songs. It wasn't working. It didn't work. There were just a few standout tracks on there. Standout is a very strong word to use in terms of Big Wheel. I liked Satellite. The system was okay, the ending of it, but the vocal did kind of get a bit annoying as the album proceeded. But it was just overall a very disappointing way to end discography that I did enjoy so much. The title track I also saved, Invisible People. And also I think I probably just saved Sam the Man because I thought he was talking to me. And it's like, it's a nod to his only English fan. That's my opinion on Big Wheel. It will get very strong praise quite quickly after this, but Big Wheel was just, oh, what a way to end.
If you think that is heavy metal, I would love to see your face listening to the first 10 seconds of an Iron Maiden song. Like, I would pay good money for that. My bottom is not Big Wheel. We're not going to be talking about Big Wheel for a while.
What?
My bottom is clearly the worst Icehouse album, in my opinion. One of the worst albums I've covered on the channel, Measure for Measure. This album sucks. It's so bad. I've given it a 3 out of 10. By this point in the dive, I was firmly unenthused. Paradise opens the album and is like so aggressively cheesy. One thing I noted about Ivor Davis is that he doesn't really have a personality. The first album, As Flowers, he's trying to rip off Lou Reed. Second album, he decides he's going to start ripping off Brian Ferry, which he kind of carries on into Sidewalk. And then pretty much for Measure, he's like, this David Bowie guy, he's pretty cool. And he starts to sing like David Bowie. And it's so distracting. Like every song almost in this discography sounds like either a Roxy Music B-side or a David Bowie B-side. And it's like so distracting. No Promises is the first song where I was like, oh, this sounds very Bowie-esque, but not the era of Bowie that I like. The album this reminded me most was Never Let Me Down, which is my least favorite of all 27 Bowie albums. It's this sort of really artificial sounding 80s sound. There's so much going on without much purpose. The only song I would say is solid is The Flame, which I knew already. And another problem I have with Ivor Davis is his lyrics are at best lazy, at worst really bad. There's the song Mr. Big where he's like, when he wants to walk, he'll walk all over you. He don't do the things that little people do. I'm like, come on, that's so lame.
Mr. Big? Don't analyze that.
It's just, and the album was like mediocre to slightly bad until the last 2 songs, which are unbearably terrible, in my opinion. Lucky Me with this sort of faux intelligent lyrics, and then it just goes off into a random jazz part in the middle, and it's like clearly trying to be artsy and different and not working. And I do agree with you in one way, and even though I don't really rate Ivor Davis as a songwriter, I think he was much better suited to the simple pop songs, like something like The Flame, and not something like Lucky Me. Whenever he tries to be meaningful, or later in his career when he tries to make political statements, it just falls off a cliff. Baby You're So Strange, also not a great, pretty bad way to close the album. So it's going to be up from here, but I really hated this album. I've got to be honest. Measure for Measure is my number 7.
Okay. I'm okay. It's fine. I mean, you wouldn't get away with it if the comparisons that you made weren't painfully accurate. Like, I hadn't spotted it myself. I'm a fanboy, but you are right in comparing him to Brian Ferry and David Bowie as a knockoff. But
anyway. I also get it that like the 80s albums in particular are already at a disadvantage for me because it's not my preferred sound. It's like sort of AOR-ish, like, it's not the 80s pop that I like already. And then when it's just reminding me of artists I like more, it's sort of just making it sink a little bit more. So maybe that's the vocals probably made me enjoy it less, just because I was constantly being reminded of people I liked more.
Oh, Tom, I am sorry for putting you through this. I don't mean the listening experience, I mean what's to come. So, my number 6, climbing up to a 7. Oh, Tom, you just got to accept this isn't going to be a surprise. I'm
Hey,
gonna have
I'm
you're not.
accepting it. I'm accepting it. I'm just processing it. Okay.
My number 6 is Code Blue. So far we are working backwards in the discography, which I guess makes sense. He's starting to peter out. I got more out of Code Blue than I thought. Front loaded again though. The main songs really were Mercy on the Boy, The Great Divide. Miss Divine was all right. It was quite fun and just a cheesy little love song. And Jericho Bay near the end was a great surprise. Those were really good ones. It's low for me because there were a few songs that I didn't save. I think there were about 3 or 4 that I ended up not saving from this album. They weren't fab, but it was still Icehouse to me, and I did really enjoy it. I think I'm going to just pretend you don't think what you think about Ivor Davis's songwriting and just go in and say that I think that his lyricism is sure. If you think it's not very developed, that's fine. I think it's doing something quite interesting. There's a lot of storytelling that I think he does. There's definitely this in The Great Divide is something quite Australian about it, about this idea of tribes and about this great divide. I think that is similar to what he did in The Flame and Measure for Measure, talking about the segregation of the indigenous people and the settlers, if you like, the colonizers that came later. Midnight Oil did it as well, and it was clearly something that meant a lot to Ivor Davis. The Great Divide, I think, in my interpretation, is about that. And Jericho Bay is this story about someone going away from home and carrying these mementos and the story about that. And I think those 2 songs in particular, The Great Divide and Jericho Bay, are really catchy and up there with some of the best that Icehouse did. And it will reflect in the song's video, spoilers. But there are some really good ones. Wind and Sail's also good. Miss Divine, Harbour Town, Mercy on the Boy. Those are good. I think Code Blue it's slipping down in quality for Icehouse, but it's still worth being part of the discography where Big Wheel didn't. So it's a 7 from me. Number 6, Big Wheel. Not Big Wheel, Code Blue. Not Big Wheel.
We're not going to agree on many things today, but we both agree that Code Blue is the second worst Icehouse album. It's my number 6, but for me, it's a 4 out of 10. I was actually very intrigued by this album because I'd been a bit worn down by the 80s. And I read that this was a concept album with each song relating to newspaper clippings the band had found, which were then inserted into the sort of album sleeve with the lyrics. That's a really interesting concept. Again, the problem for me is that Ivor Davis as a songwriter, in most cases, can't really pull it off. The 2 songs you mentioned, The Great Divide and Jericho Bay, are pretty good examples of storytelling. My problem lies with the rest of the album.
Right.
The intro of the first song is really bizarre, but the song has some cool moments, but it doesn't really hang together. Again, there's a lot of Bowie imitation going along. Sorry, Sam, really don't like Harbour Town. I think the vocals sound really bad, especially the backing vocals, and there's like those do-do-dos throughout the song, which just feels like it goes on forever. The Great Divide is cool. It has that sort of different sound. It has some like slide guitar and some acoustic instrumentation, which is something really different for them. So I respect that they were doing that. I don't think it's a great song or anything, but it it's okay. It's definitely one of the best songs on the album. I really don't like Miss Divine. This is some of the snarkiest notes I wrote in this entire thing. So that seems them branching out and doing something different. Good for them. I'm so happy they're doing something different. Now they're ripping off the Waterboys instead. Ivor Davis is more of an impressionist than a singer, I wrote, but he's a damn good impressionist. The song is kind of annoying, and the fact that he sounds so much like Mike Scott. Why? Why doesn't he just pick a lane? Like, he was doing the whole Brian Ferry thing for a couple albums, and it was kind of working. And then he was like, okay, I'm going to switch over to being Bowie and Mike Scott and Brian Ferry all at the same time. Well, changing from song to song. So it's really distracting. I think Big Fun is really one of the worst songs in the discography. I think the lyrics are pathetic, frankly.
Fine, I didn't save it. Didn't like it.
I was hearing that, so I was like, Sam's not going to like this one. And then you get Anything Is Possible, which I think it's either this or Lucky Me is my least favorite song in the entire discography. The chorus sounds like something out of High School Musical. It's so generic and lifeless and like anything is possible.
Yeah, I didn't say that either. I'm glad we do agree on that.
Yeah, but yeah, that makes Jericho Bay even more puzzling coming after this sequence of songs that I just was finding so bad. And then Jericho Bay, I would go as far as to say, is a really good song. It's got these, it's the one song where you can tell that the concept of the album was being followed through with and that he was really into the story and it actually matters to the song rather than, you know, taking newspaper clippings and making a song called Anything Is Possible, which is the most generic thing you could do. The chorus maybe does repeat one time too many for me, but that's a small thing. Overall, it's a little bit better than Measure for Measure, mainly because I like the sound of the album more, but it's still not a good album overall, even though I wanted to like this one because of the concept, but it felt so sort of underdone. And yeah, that's my take on Code Blue. It's not the worst thing ever, but it's not good either.
You're definitely right in that, like the songs on those last two albums that I talked about, these Big Wheel and Code Blue, for me, these songs I didn't like, they did go on too long and it damned both albums. It's like, yeah, you could have had it there, but you egged it out, you eked it out too much, milked it for all it was worth. In Big Wheel went down from 6 to a 5 for that reason, and Code Blue went from 8 to a 7 for that reason too. My number 5 is an album that I did want to be higher, but it can't be. It's Icehouse by Flowers. It's when I first listened to the album before diving into discography again, I was really pleasantly surprised how well they did it. I thought for what it was, the early part of their career, just starting out, I thought, wow, that's pretty good. I didn't think they would find their feet really until Primitive Man, but it felt like they had a good idea of what they wanted to do in that album. And I initially put it an 8. It dropped down to a 7, just in the context of the rest of the discography when I reflected on it. The production really wasn't up there yet. I feel as though, with the exception of a couple of songs, the lyrics weren't really there either. It's all very basic. Particularly We Can Get Together, which is just intensely repetitive. We can get together. All right, get it. But I still enjoyed it. It's one of the singles from it. But the standout track on that one, by a country mile, is the opener, Icehouse, which I really liked. It felt that out of all of the album, felt like it could be anywhere in the discography or in a good part of the discography. And I really like the thought of it being the song Icehouse from the album Icehouse by Icehouse. I don't know. I'm a very chaotic man. But I think that as far as a debut goes, it showed promise and it launched their career and eventually they went international. It's definitely a debut. I think if it was later in the discography, I wouldn't be so kind to it, but it's nice. I enjoyed it. I'd go back to it and listen to it again. And it's the last 7 in the discography.
Yeah, it's nice to see your enthusiasm. Even if I don't understand it at all, that's fine. But so my number 5 is going to break your heart a little bit, and it is Sidewalk. You know, I actually mentioned that Measure for Measure as the first Bowie imitations, but actually the opening track of this album was the first time where I was like, is he trying to sing like David Bowie now? Yeah, and it's I don't know. He has that sort of same vocal timbre, but people listen to that song and tell me that I'm right because I am. It's like, all
right, well, I guess I won't disagree then.
I'm not saying that it's a bad song. I just mean that was the first time where I got the light bulb moment of and then I guess maybe I was listening out for it more after that. And you know, the production on this album is a big stickler for me. I think it's aged really poorly, especially the sound of the bass. Like the bass lines on the album are really good and maybe my favorite part of the album, but the bass sounds like kind of warbly and like not very clear, which is a very sort of 80s thing. It sounds a bit processed. So not, kind of ruins my favorite part of the album. But there are some more good songs on here than there are on Code Blue, particularly Someone Like You, which is a pretty solid bit of songwriting, a bit more atmospheric, which I think works in their favor. And Stay Close Tonight as well, which I think the softer songs on this album worked a lot better than the more sort of overt poppy songs. Like I said, I prefer a different production style, but I kind of get what I'm given, I guess. And aside from those two songs, nothing really stood out either way, like there isn't anything bad. It just sort of washes over me for the most part. So it's a 5 out of 10. I think it's okay. That's Sidewalk. I don't really have much to say about that one, which is probably a good thing for you because my bottom two I had plenty to say about.
Yeah. Oh god, well, we're climbing up the list now. I don't know if it ever gets good for you, but we'll see. My number four is Man of Colours, which upon re-listen pleasantly surprised me, because I've spoken to you before we were ever going to do Icehouse. I never thought it was going to be on the cards. Kind of wish it wasn't now, because you've broken my heart. But beforehand, before we ever thought about doing it, I was telling you how I was feeling about the discography, and I didn't speak very highly about Man of Colours. I can safely say now that I think quite well of it now, just because it's different from the other three. I can now appreciate that doesn't make it bad. It's actually really good. There's a good consistent sound. It makes for a really good listening experience, and it doesn't really dip out of what they were trying to achieve. It's a very consistent album, and it goes different when necessary. Crazy is a very good song in terms of breaking the tone. Electric Blue is really good as well, and my heart was warmed to Man of Colours as well, which I thought was a little bit too slow and tepid before, but it's got more going for it than I gave credit for. So sorry, Ivor. But I saved every song from that album. I was very impressed, especially given how I felt about it before, and I was absolutely dreading listening to it. So it really came out of the gate with it. It was really good. I was very pleasantly surprised. It's an 8. So I heartily recommend this album. I really enjoyed listening to Man of Colours.
Yeah, and you will be pleasantly surprised to hear that I am, with each album, I'm getting up by a score so far. That won't last forever, but
no, I'm sure,
else I'd end up as a 10 at the end.
Yeah, that's not bad. I know that.
But my number 4 is a 6 out of 10, which means I think it is decent, above average. And that is an album you've mentioned already, Icehouse, the debut album. This was an interesting way to kick off their career, because I get what you're saying about the title song being, which is a great song, being sort of the most similar to the rest of their discography. But I do feel like this is an outlier almost entirely. It coming out in the very early 80s, it feels very, what's the word? It's not as full a production sound, which maybe kind of works better for me, because it felt like some of those mid 80s ones were a bit overly busy. This one feels very sparse and very cold, which is an issue I have with it, is that it does feel very cold, and there isn't, I think the best Icehouse songs have quite a bit of emotion and heart to them. And I think that's when Ivor Davis does shine, is when he really just gets you in the heartstrings. It doesn't happen that often for me, I'll be honest, but when it does, it's really good. And that isn't really what this album is all about. This album is about creating a sound, creating an atmosphere. And I think most of the songs are okay. But I do think the titular song is great. I am a fan of We Can Get Together. I agree with you that the chorus does go on and on and on, but I think they earn it. I think it's a good chorus. I think there's a lot more guitar on this album than there is on their later albums, which is kind of cool. You think you got Fat Man, which is a very strange song. And Sister was the first song where I really noticed the lyrics being particularly bad. And that sort of set a precedent for a lot of the discography. Again, not all. There are moments Ivor Davis really, really finds it. And side one does kind of struggle for me to live up to its hot start. But Can't Help Myself starts side 2 really well. It has a sort of Talking Heads sort of funky vibe, which is cool. And the rest of the album is okay. You know, it's solid. It's apart from the closer, Not My Kind, which is a bit of a mess, I think. I think the rest of the album is pretty decent. The only problem with it, I think, is that the only highlights are the first 2 songs and Can't Help Myself for me. It's not the best debut in the world, but there are some good moments and songs I would go back to rather than maybe the entire thing. But it's solid. I've not really got much to complain about for that album.
Fair play. I'm glad you got above the halfway mark. You got to 6.
Look, I felt really bad after my number 5, so I had to try and be positive there. I'm sorry, Sam. I'm deeply sorry.
This has all just been revenge for how I responded to Elliott Smith. I've been waiting for this.
I mean, I would much rather. I hate doing this. I would much rather have really enjoyed this, and we'd be able to.
So would I. I'd rather you had enjoyed this.
But you know, I didn't choose for it to be this way for me.
Anyway, medal position, and I am way ahead of you in scores when we reach this point. I am now at 9. And my bronze medal is what I'm thinking and hoping is actually going to be your number 1. It's Primitive Man, or as it was released in the UK, Love in Motion, which I bought from the last record hall. As it turns out, this is how our country saw Icehouse for the first time.
Wow, I've rewatched that video and I didn't even bother to check, and I just assumed you were right and it was a compilation.
But in that, interestingly, I said all of the songs seem to just be from Primitive Man, so I'm not sure if it's just reshuffled, and it turns out it is. That's exactly what it is. This is the UK release of Primitive Man, and it's a different album. But what I will say, now this is going to start getting complicated, right? If we were reviewing Love in Motion, this would be a 10. This track listing, and it's got one different track from Primitive Man, but this order with this additional track is a 10 out of 10 album and could be the top. However, we are reviewing Primitive Man, so that's only a 9. But if it was this specifically, if that was the only way we saw this album, this would be the number 1. But it's not, so it's not. I think Primitive Man is, in terms of production, probably the best. I think it sounds the best. I think it's very coherent. I think there's a lot of very deep lyricism, especially with Great Southern Land. There's a reason why that's the big one. I only know 2 songs about Australia. Well, I guess 3 if you want to count Beds of Burning, but that's really more about colonialism, right? Land Down Under, or just Down Under by Men at Work, and this song. And Down Under is very much like, yeah, we're Australian and we're a bit weird. And this is a bit more pensive and a little bit more thoughtful. And I feel as though Ivor Davis had a slightly more nuanced perspective on Australia and being Australian than Men at Work did, who I guess they were just like, this is our USP. We're Australian. We're an Australian version of the Police. That's my opinion on Men at Work. But that's really good. I think there are a lot of standout tracks in it. I think the majority of it is really good. This version of the album, Love in Motion, opens with Uniform. So a very different way of opening it. But I think it sets the tone in a very different way, and it makes you think about the album differently to how Primitive Man opened. Street Cafe is quite a nice song. I think it's pretty good. It doesn't hit as hard as some, but I think that's really good. Then this mix goes on to Hey Little Girl, which is all right. It's fine. Glam, whatever, it's there. This side ends with Great Southern Land. Now, I do like them, right? If I can listen to the whole album and not be concerned about skipping it, I'm doing really well. But there are going to be favourites. And okay, Glam it's like a bridge, basically. The B-side opens with Trojan Blue. I love Trojan Blue. That one really hits hard for me for some reason. Then Love in Motion is the bonus track that you get on this, which on this version of the album is the title track. but it's a bonus track on Spotify on Icehouse by Flowers. So I've managed to save it to my playlist that way. It's really good, and it enhances this album's experience, and you don't get that listening to Primitive Man. So that's how come this one bumps up to a 10 where Primitive Man doesn't. And then I was really surprised that Mysterious Thing One by One came in, and they're more intense. I think they have a lot of drive to them. They're really pushing through that, because I think Icehouse front load a lot. The best songs are normally at the front of the album. I quite like the fact that they want to pick up the momentum on that B-side and not let it get lackluster. And I think it ends really strongly with Goodnight, Mr. Matthews, which when we listened to it, I had no recollection of whatsoever. I think by that point, we were both a little bit disillusioned with it all. But listening to it this time, I have a lot more enthusiasm for it. I think it's a really strong closer, and it's a great swan song for the tone that they set for this album. I really enjoy it. I very much enjoy owning this version on vinyl. I don't know, based on the fact this is the British release, I don't know if I'll ever see Primitive Man at a record fair. That would be very rare indeed. But as I've said, I think this mix is actually better than Primitive Man. So I'm a lot happier to own this anyway. The British just had it better, didn't they? What can we say?
Yep, nice review. Nice review. I can make you rest easy now, because my bronze medal is Big Wheel.
All right.
But it is a 6 out of 10, which is only one score higher than you had it, and you had it at the bottom. So we're not that far apart on it. In fact, we're probably closer on this album than we are on most albums on this list. But what's interesting about this one is that I think you'll agree with me, at least on this one, is that this vocally is the one where he goes the most into the David Bowie. Like, especially the first 3 or 4 songs, it is like, am I just listening to a David Bowie lost album from the 90s? Which obviously for me, I've just said lost album from the 90s and not B-side collection. So obviously that we're getting a level up higher now. Not that David Bowie's 90s work was that impressive. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. I was very excited by the first 2 songs on this album. I think Big Wheel is an amazing opener. I think it's really cool. I think it's really catchy and got a lot of oomph to it, which is something I was missing on a lot of their stuff, where it feels a little bit just a bit apologetic. I was going to say unapologetic. That's not what I mean. A little bit apologetic. It's like, yeah, well, we're going to tell you a story now, and you can listen if you want. Yeah. Whereas this is like, you're listening now. And it is a little bit derivative of Bowie. But one thing I will note about this album is that this album, sonically, in terms of its sound, doesn't sound like anything David Bowie ever did, and it sort of sets itself apart in that regard. So I could sort of take that association away, which was nice. Satellite is definitely the song in the entire discography that rips off Bowie the most, because it's almost written like a David Bowie song. The lyrics about space and all this kind of stuff. It feels very, very David Bowie. So obviously I think it's great. And I think you mentioned the synths are gone mostly here, which is maybe why this album works a bit better for me. Even though my top 2 are from the 80s, I think this is probably my second favorite in terms of the sound of the album. But after those 2 songs, I will admit the songwriting is where it kind of drifts off a bit. It's a bit more gritty and less cluttered production, and it rocks a bit, but Goodbye Valentine doesn't really continue the hot streak. It's okay. And at that point, I was just writing, all my notes were just, it's getting creepy how his inflections and vocal quirks are similar to Bowie on this album in particular. Because before it was like, okay, he's got a similar vocal tone. Whereas on this album, it's like he was like doing all the different Bowie quirks. I was like, this is just weird. Judas is another not so great one, and Feed the Machine is another example where Ivor Davis tries to get political, and no bueno. The album does drift a bit into anonymity, but there are songs that stand out, and it isn't too long. Like I was never feeling like, God, when's this going to be over? It starts off with some of the most inspired material, I think, but I think for the most part, it is just sort of pleasant background music, in my opinion, which is why it's only a 6, whereas I was quite optimistic at the start of the album. So Big Wheel gets the bronze, although Sam won't feel like it's that much of of a strong bronze at a 6 out of 10, but it's the best I can do. It's how I feel, and I can't help that, unfortunately.
Oh, well, at least it's not number one. Otherwise, we'd have got like totally different things out of Icehouse. And I feel like we almost have.
I was just going to say that would have been exactly like Elliott Smith if that would have happened.
Yeah. Oh, dear. Right. Silver medal. I feel like this is win or lose for you now.
To be honest, I'm not really fussed either way.
That's good. That's good, because my number 2, Sidewalk. Sidewalk is a 9 out of 10, and it could have been number 1. But I do think you are right in terms of the production. It is dated. You can tell this is an album from the 80s. This is kind of, as you near the mid-80s and where you are at this point, 1984, you're getting outside the era where just playing a synthesizer works. And yeah, the bass line, love it. I love the bass work of Guy Pratt on this album. And he's got a YouTube channel where he goes over some of his bass lines from different artists that he's done sessions with. And he does the bass line from Stay Close Tonight, which absolutely slaps. And I think is probably the most naturalistic bass line on the entire album. I think that sounds most in the right place out of all the songs there. But I think you're right, the bass is a little bit, especially on Taking the Town. I do notice that the bass sounds odd on it, but I still really enjoy it. I'd like Taking the Town. I also think that Someone Like You, Stay Close Tonight, Don't Believe Anymore, and Dusty Pages, all 5 of them are brilliant songs. I love those songs, and I've had them on repeat for a number of years. As far as the sound goes, even though I don't think it's refined, I think it's steady and it's consistent. I don't think he does anything out of place. I don't feel like it's messy. But yes, it's a child of the 80s, as Ivor Davis was. I think he does a lot with the songwriting, especially on Don't Believe Anymore. I think that's a power anthem in terms of being totally exacerbated in love. I think a lot of his lyricism goes into a different character that he talks about in the pronouns he or she. But this one is I Don't Believe Anymore. So it feels more personal. And I think it's a standout on this album, along with the others I mentioned, especially Stay Close Tonight. Sorry, got to itch my nose. Please edit that out.
I mean, it's too late. It's staying in now.
Oh, no.
I itch my nose all the time. It's fine.
That was major.
Yeah.
Never mind. There it is.
So, it does kind of suck that we're so far apart on this, but I think you like my top 2 albums at least. So that's something you can take away from this. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
I'm still at a 6 at Silver.
Oh,
It's
shit.
a strong 6, and my number 1 is not a 6. So
Okay. Well, I was thinking in my head, if he gets to 7, I'll be happy.
well, I will on my number 1. But
But for now,
Man of Colors is my number 2, which really should have been a 7, because based on the first half of the album, I think Crazy aside, which I think is not a very good opener, I think it's another example of Ivor Davis shooting a bit too far with lyrics and not really committing and just ending up being a bit too generic. I think the album gets in a bit of a roll then for the next 4 or 5 tracks. I think Electric Blue is insanely cheesy, but by the end of the song, I was completely won over. And that is the song that's been climbing up my songs list, where I'm listening to like, this is the most insanely cheesy song that they did. But for some reason, it's really catchy and I'm really enjoying it. And it's putting a smile on my face. So I don't know what that's all about.
who knew you could enjoy Icehouse?
I mean, I have a top 10 of songs that I like, that's something. Nothing too serious, a bit ska influenced in parts. It's kind of weird. Reminding me a bit of I Just Can't Stop It in parts.
Yeah.
Like not what I was expecting from Icehouse. The title track, I think, is really solid. I get what you mean in it being a bit slow and meandering, but it's got a memorable melody and it kind of sticks with you. And I do think that the slow songs are generally better than the less slow songs for Icehouse, like I said. And it is key thing for me. It doesn't feel like it's ripping off anybody. Like if someone asked me what Ivor Davis actually sounds like, and I had to guess what his natural singing voice sounds like, I would say Man of Colors. the song. So that was nice. The lyrics are simple, but they work and they're effective, and the melody is nice. So I'm not asking for these complex lyrics, because he can do lyrics that are simple and emotional and meaningful. But then sometimes he'll try and write about like war, and I'm like, why? Why are you doing this? We'll get to that later in the album. I think Heartbeat Kid is also pretty solid. Like, lyrics are a bit hit and miss, but Davis's vocals, he's actually singing with a lot of conviction, which was nice to hear. And I think The Kingdom is a solid song. So you might be wondering why this is a 6. It's because there's another half of the album to go. You get My Obsession, which is solid enough until the chorus, which I don't think is a very good chorus. Girl in the Moon, not a fan of that one. Really stupid lyrics. Anybody's War, see my point previously. I think, to put it bluntly, my biggest issue with Icehouse, even if the production is an issue for me at times, I think Ivor Davis's songwriting is where I just can't consistently connect to it. There are moments and there are fragments, like the first half of this album and a good majority of my number one, where I can connect to his songwriting. And I think this album is decent, but I can't help but feel it could have been better with more time and effort put into it. I mean, I don't know how long they spent on it, but that's the impression I get from listening to it. So it's close to a 7, just on the strength of, well, everything in the first half apart from the opening track, which we're all in contention for my songs list, and then the second half just doesn't really hold it up. So Man of Colors is my number 2. It's decent.
Okay, fair enough. Very good. Even though it's a 6, it is still at least a glowing review. As far as you're concerned, but like
Sam, you got to trust me. I'm doing my best. I'm trying.
I know. Thank you. I appreciate it. Now, what you're now going to have to try your best to, rather than trying to tactfully word your reviews, now you have to exercise restraint, because I'm going to pretend you did not rank Measure for Measure at your bottom album. Right. This feels like a big coming out album. This is a 10. This is a 10 out of 10 album. I love this. I feel as though this is the best of all the worlds that you could get with Ivor Davis. I think the production value is up there. It's an improvement from Sidewalk, but I think that his lyricism is definitely on point here. It opens on this album with No Promises. There's a different track listing for the vinyl. I don't know why. It opens with No Promises, which, fun fact, my dad's cousin directed the British music video for. So I just got to shamelessly plug him. And then it goes over to Cross the Border, which, okay, let me tell you the thing about this album, right? I've got it as a 10 out of 10 because this album, you can put on, listen to it, and I just love it because everything flows from one thing to the other. Now, it does not mean that I would go out and look for every single song at any given moment. I don't think that every song on this album is worthy of praise on its own. Bless you. Not like Violator of Depeche Mode, which is a 10 out of 10, and I would listen to one of the songs on the album on its own.
Yeah, it like you rank within your scale, right? It's not like every 10 out of 10 is made equal. I get what you mean.
Yeah, this is a 10 out of 10 in terms of the album listening experience. I can enjoy this album thoroughly. So back with that, Cross the Border, not a song I would hunt out on its own, but it follows on from No Promises really well. And I think it's a great bridge over to the tracks that close the album, which are Spanish Gold, Paradise, and The Flame. The Flame has now been overplayed a little bit for me because when I first heard it, I absolutely fell in love with it. About the subject matter. He was writing about apartheid, which was a massive point of contention in the world media in the 80s, and that was his threatening bit on it. I thought it was quite poignant. I thought it was quite well done as well, because it was about specific events that had been happening, like the 19 Voices Are Still, Now 10,000 Will Fight. It was about some sort of event that happened where 19 Black people were killed for some sort of reason. I can't remember the background now, but it was about a specific event that he was referencing in the song. And I think that was a really nice touch. It then goes over to the B-side, which when I first listened to it, I was like, yes, this is nowhere near as strong as the A-side. The A-side really comes out. He puts everything good at the front to try and hook you in and get you to stay. That being said, I've had a lot more time with this album than you have, and I've grown to really appreciate the tracks on it. Regular Boys is so out of left field and intense, but absolutely slaps. And he does a lot with the vocal melody. There's a lot of variety in the song, and I think it's fantastic for that. I wish he hadn't picked up so much on Mr. Big, because it's definitely a weak link in the chain. But again, a good bridge. I love how Angel Street just turns what you thought the B-side was going to be on its head and just comes in with this soft melody and about this person that's kind of forgettable but knows it, and the kind of melancholy of just being apathetic, I think. And it ends with Lucky Me and Baby You're So Strange, which I used to just turn off. I never used to. Yeah, I know. I never used to listen to them. I didn't think anything of them. Lucky Me has come up for me because I think it's very catchy. I never really thought that before, but I guess the more I listened to the album, the more I listened to the song, I was starting to notice what he was doing more, and it was starting to mean more to me. It helps that I've listened to this 3 or 4 times before doing the dive. I appreciate that. And if this was on first listen, this wouldn't be at the top, right? But then Baby You're So Strange, it's, I think, quite a strong way to end the album. I think that the repetition and the ba 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 da da with him going, "You're so strange," it's classic Ivor Davis to me. You compare him a lot to David Bowie, and I think in some albums you're right. I don't think so here. I think that Ivor Davis has quite a unique voice. I feel as though he sounds very Australian based on my knowledge of 80s Australian pop of the time. He reminds me a bit of the vocalist from 1927, but turned up to 11. And I think that even though Baby You're So Strange is not going to make the songs list, it wasn't even in contention, I think it fits into its place in the album well. And I'm really grateful to have it on vinyl. It's a 10 out of 10 album for me, just as Love in Motion is as well. So they're up there in terms of my collection. And I'm so sorry that you haven't had the same experience as me. In fact, quite the opposite. But I feel a lot more confident defending this than I did with Calling All Stations, which I knew I was going out on a limb for. But I know the main crime that Icehouse committed was not being your cup of tea. And I think that there's more to say about Ivor Davis's lyricism than you give credit for. And if you ever did have the chance to re-listen to them, maybe I tie you down one day and make you and read the lyrics to you as it's going and be that kind of annoying, like borderline criminal, you could probably go on to appreciate it a third or a quarter as much as me. But there I am. I have to state my case for Measure, because if you end up, viewers at home, liking Icehouse like I do, you will like Measure for Measure.
Yeah, and I think I have a couple of points regarding what you said. I think regarding the Bowie thing, I think it helps that you know that album so well and you haven't heard all 27 David Bowie albums, and you're not coming into this as the biggest David Bowie fan in this call at the very least.
No.
So you were coming into this album not even thinking about the Bowie comparison, knowing the album very well already. And I was coming into it as a massive Bowie fan, reading reviews of people saying that it reminded them of David Bowie.
Right.
And then immediately being reminded of David Bowie, having also been reminded of David Bowie on previous albums. So, you know, it's one of those things. I think, and I think regarding his songwriting, I don't think my mind's going to change on that. I did read quite a few of the lyrics along, and I just don't think he's that good, in my opinion, in terms of a storyteller, and that's just where we've got to disagree.
Yeah. Fair enough.
However, my number one is Primitive Man, which I do like. It's a 7 out of 10. I think it's a good album. It was the only one I knew going in, and it was a 7 before I started. So obviously I didn't want it to be number one.
You didn't get a lot out of this discography. I am sorry that the one that you knew is the one that...
But you know what? I had only heard it once. And, you know, in a listening session setting is not always the best. Well, it's never really the best way to hear an album for the first time, because you're chatting to somebody, you know, you're sort of doing a few other things at once. You could argue that it's not really a suitable place to rate an album because you just get distracted and you can't really focus on it properly. So it was nice to go back to it. Um, we do kind of disagree about our favorite tracks on it. Interestingly enough, I'm not going to say Great Southern Land isn't one of the best tracks because, duh, like obviously it is. Um, I actually think Uniform is quite weak, again showing some of the lyrical shortcomings, but the guitar on it is really, really cool and really sort of almost unhinged. It just punches through the song, which I really like. And then you get Hey Little Girl, which I think is fantastic. It's one of my favorite Icehouse songs. We'll see where it ranks on my list. I think it's a really good new wave song. Great bouncing rhythm and a nice chorus. And it, you know what? I'm going to say this. It reminded me of Flesh and Blood by Roxy Music, but in a way that made me wish that this song was on Flesh and Blood. Where I was like, it's not, I was thinking of that connotation in a bad way. I was reminded of it in a good way. I was like, wow, this is a really good song. And it really does remind, especially, the Hey Little Girl, Brian Ferry vocal, but yeah, I think I agree with you. The production is really strong here. It's definitely the strongest that they had. It's much more clarity than the debut and way less cold, which is bonus for me. It's got a warmer sound, which just gives it a bit more heart, which I appreciate. I think Street Cafe carries on this really good start to the album. I do think it's quite front loaded. I agree with you that Trojan Blue is pretty cool. Glam, it's a bit of fluff, really.
Yeah.
And I think by the end of the album, it does get a little bit samey for me. There's not much in terms of variety and there's not much setting the songs apart. No, that's the biggest crime in the world, but I don't know. I don't know what I was expecting really from an 80s synth pop album. It's not really variety that they're known for, but I guess that's just a personal taste thing. Naive Little Tom wrote in his notes here, it's quite funny how on the first album he's trying to sound like Lou Reed and on the second album he's trying to sound like Brian Ferry. But I think in hindsight, it's only really Hey Little Girl, I think, where he really goes into the Brian Ferry on this album. The rest of the album, I will agree, he does have that sort of more unique vocal style, which I think helps it as well. It's not my favorite style in the world, but for the style, I think it's very, very good. And at least with this one, I can understand why you love it. So, is that good enough?
Yeah, no, I'll take it. You have yourself a deal, Mr. Willie.
So, wow, there you go. If you've watched this entire video, I think we've talked for like 50 minutes. This has been a very long video.
Yeah.
If you have never heard Icehouse and you've made it through this entire video, respect.
Yeah.
For one. And if you are an Icehouse, yeah. If you are an Ice, exactly, that's true. We'll probably have like 20 viewers, but for those of you that are Icehouse fans, maybe let me know down below what I'm missing, and maybe I'm sure Sam will give me some songs to listen to again, and maybe try and view it in a different way and with a positive spin. Because the other thing is, I think this was a factor with Elliott Smith, is that binging the albums and the Pretenders is binging the albums. It's never going to be the best experience if you're not enjoying it. And it's hard to separate that of like, I'm not enjoying this because it's not my taste, or I'm not enjoying this because I've listened to 7 Icehouse albums like it back to back, So we're not back to back. We did it over the course of weeks, but you know what I mean?
It took a while.
It's so that might be a factor as well. And my top 4 albums are all albums I would be willing to give another shot. I'll be honest, I don't think Sidewalk, Code Blue, and Measure for Measure really stand a chance of grabbing me, just because of Code Blue, the songwriting, and the other 2, the sound of them is just not my thing. So
I wouldn't go back to my bottom 3 either. I've got the songs I like from them, and that's all I need.
So, it happens. Our next discography, I think, is going to be the Smiths, which we haven't really decided.
Get the viewers back.
Yeah, we've done a lot of obscure discographies this year. I was just thinking we need to do a few more that people actually know, because we've done The Beat, the Blue Nile, the Cardigans, and Icehouse all this year. And last year we did like the Beatles and Depeche Mode and Genesis and Elliott Smith. So we've got to bring it back a bit, I think.
Yeah.
But stay tuned for the songs video either later this week or early next. If you have listened to Icehouse, let us know what you think of them, and hopefully
I'm not alone, am I?
I'm sure there will be plenty of Australians who will have you back. And hopefully we will catch you soon.